There are many enigmas in the Torah, but in this week's Torah portion, the enigma is the very name of the portion. The Torah portion is entitled Balak. It's about Balak. Balak was the king of Moab. He had just experienced something that he had dreaded. The two protectors, the kings who were supposed to protect his country of Moab, had been defeated by the Jews, which we read at the end of last week's portion. The two kings, mighty kings, Sichon and Og. And now the Jewish people are poised to enter into the land of Canaan, and he was terrified that they might come and overrun his country. So he hires Bilam, a heathen prophet, really vile individual, to curse the Jews so that they could be eliminated. And God turns the curses into blessings, and that's how his plot to destroy the Jews had failed. But in the end, Bilam advises the Midianites and the Moabites to allow their daughters to go free, to seduce the Jewish men and cause them to worship idols, and that brought disaster to the Jewish people. And all that started with Balak. So Balak was not a nice guy. Balak was not a righteous person. Balak was not even a good person. Balak was a vile, evil king who hated the Jewish people. And yet we name a Torah portion after him. We have Torah portions named after righteous people. We have Noah, we have Sarah, we have Yisro, we have Pinchas. Why would we want to name a Torah portion after a wicked person? Now you could ask, we already named one a few weeks ago. We read Korach. Korach was also a bad person. But the difference is significant. Korach, his intentions were good. He wanted to become the high priest because he wanted to come closer to God. He was a visionary. He saw into the future, a glorious future, and he thought that the future was now. There are so many explanations that show that Korach was really someone who was very much steeped in spirituality and godliness. He veered off the right path in the end. But we celebrate his motives, his original motives, by naming the Parsha after him and saying that, yes, you should emulate Korach if it's his motives, but not his actions when he went off the proper path and went against Moses and had a downfall. That's the part we don't emulate, but we emulate his nobility in terms of what he wanted for himself, what spiritual advancement he wanted. But Balak, what did he do to deserve having a Torah portion named after him? If someone asks the Jew, what's this week's portion? It's Balak, and you live with it. It's not just reading a portion of the Torah every week. We're supposed to live with it, and we live with a name as well, and a name is very significant in Judaism. A name represents the soul of that thing which has the name. So it means the soul of this week's Torah portion is an evil person. I saw several explanations. One explanation, not satisfying, is that there are two kinds of evil people. There are evil people who show how evil they are. They say it openly. They're not afraid. They don't hide it. They don't lie about it. And then there are most of the evil people, most of the anti-Semites of the world. You don't even know that they're anti-Semites. They keep it inside. We saw this October 7th. So many of the people we thought were good people that were on our side came out with opposition to the Jewish people in a time of crisis, in a time of need. So we found out who were our true friends, who were our true enemies. But these people are insidiously evil, because you don't even know them, that they are evil, until a time comes when you can't even defend yourself against them. So there's something to be said about an evil person who's openly evil, because not only that you can protect yourself from that person, but it shows that this person has at least some integrity, that they're honest about it. We give them credit for their honesty. And that's why Balak is named Balak, because in comparison to other evil people, he had the integrity at least to show it openly. It's not a satisfying explanation, because it still doesn't make sense that we would name a Parsha after someone who was so evil, even if his evil design was not something that he hid. There's another explanation, that Balak, the Talmud says, got credit for bringing sacrifices. And it teaches you that even if you do things for ulterior motives, if they're good things, it's a good thing. You should never desist from doing a mitzvah because you have no pure motives. Your motives are ulterior, because eventually from the ulterior motive you will come to do it for the right motive. And Balak was the one who brought sacrifices, and because of that, even though he did it for the wrong reason, but he did something positive, he merited that his descendant was Ruth, the Moabite princess who converted to Judaism, whose great-grandson was King David, and from King David emerged the Davidic dynasty up until and through Mashiach. All this came about because of Balak's gesture of bringing sacrifices. So when we're naming the Parsha Balak, we're naming it not after this man Balak, we're naming it after the process that he put into motion that eventually will lead to Mashiach. The Rebbe gave a different explanation, and the Rebbe explained that when you see what Balak accomplished by hiring Bilam intended to curse the Jews, but instead of curses, out came the most beautiful blessings. First of all, the prayer that we recite every morning, Matovu, how goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. This is a praise of a Jewish home. It's a praise of Jewish places of worship, a Jewish place of study. And it's so beautiful that these holy words came out of Bilam's mouth. And who caused it? Who was responsible for this to happen? It was Balak. And then later on we read how Bilam prophesies the coming of Mashiach. I see him, but not now. I see it, but in the distance. And he predicts the coming of Mashiach. It's one of the most beautiful pieces of spiritual poetry expressing the deepest, the most sublime ideas of Judaism. All this we have to thank Balak. He was the one responsible for bringing this into fruition. I would just add that even though you could say Bilam is the one who said those prophecies, but Bilam was hired. He was not the one who initiated this. If Balak had not hired him, it would have never occurred to Bilam to say those curses, to intend those curses coming out as blessings. It was Balak who set this process into motion. Now, why was Balak so concerned? It says by Yagar Moab, he was terrified, because Sichon and Og, the two kings of the Amorim and the Bashanites, the two kingdoms that the Israelites defeated, were hired to protect the Moabites, protect that no one should enter and infiltrate his land. And here, the people that he hired were defeated, were gone. So he was terrified that the Jews would come to him next and overrun Moab. Now, there's a great Kabbalist of the 17th or 18th century known as the Megala Amukos. And he says that just like we have a mezuzah that protects us, and mezuzah prevents negative influences from entering the home, negative spiritual influences, and by extension physical harm, they are a barrier for all the negatives, not allowing them to infiltrate. Just as there are positive mezuzahs, there are also negative mezuzahs, because King Solomon says in Ecclesiastes that God created zeh l'uma zeh, this opposite this, that anything you have in the realm of goodness and holiness, you have its counterpart in the realm of impurity. So if there's a mezuzah that is a holy mezuzah, there's also an unholy mezuzah that has the opposite purpose. Its objective is to prevent good influences from entering the home. Or in the historical case of Sichon and Og, they were there to prevent the Israelites, the Jewish people, the holy nation, from entering into the land of Canaan and turning it into a land of Israel, into a holy land. They were the barrier to not allow holiness to enter the land. So you have the opposite of what our mezuzah is. Sichon and Og were the mezuzahs of impurity. Now, the Hebrew word used here for fear, vayagar, is an unusual word. Usually when the Torah wants to say that he had fear, it would say vayira, as it says about Jacob, vayira Yaakov, Jacob was afraid. Here it uses another word, vayagar. So the Megala Amukos explains that vayagar numerically adds up to 213, and Sichon and Og, their names also add up to 213, because in Hebrew, every letter is also a number. So we know that the fear was related to Sichon and Og. But that we already know from the text of the Torah. But then he adds another thing. In a mezuzah, if you ever look at a mezuzah, the scroll has the writing of the Shema and 2 paragraphs of the Torah in which the words mezuzah, where the mitzvah of mezuzah is mentioned. But if you turn the mezuzah over to the backside, it has a code, a Hebrew code. It's 3 words that are unintelligible because they're not really words, they're a code. What is the code? It's God's name, God, our God, God. The tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God, the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey, then the word Elokeinu, our God, and then again the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey. So how is that coded in? You take the next letter instead of the letter of the God's name. The God's name begins with the letter Yud, so it has a Chaf, the next letter. The next letter of God's name is a Hey, so the next letter here is a Vav, the next letter. If you take those 3 words in the Mezuzah code, as it's called, it numerically adds up to 213, which is an allusion, a hint to the fact that a mezuzah is connected to Sichon and Og. They were a negative mezuzah. And it's significant that this code is on the back of the mezuzah. Why is it on the back? Because the front of the mezuzah represents the mezuzah in the realm of holiness. The back of the mezuzah represents what a mezuzah could mean when it's in code. It could become a negative. And the purpose of our mezuzah is to vanquish the negative form of mezuzah. Now, a mezuzah, Sichel and Og were 2 people. Mezuzah, there's only 1 mezuzah for each door. So the Hasidic work, Bnei Yissaschar, says that a mezuzah really has 2 functions. The mezuzah has a function to protect the inhabitants of that home. It's for the inside. And the mezuzah also has significance because it protects us when we're on the outside. There are 2 types of protection. And then he shows how this corresponds to Sichon and Og. When Sichon attacked the Jewish people, he left his own city. He went outside to confront them. That's the threat that we have from the outside. And in terms of modern life, the outside represents all the negative influences from the media, from society with all sorts of warped ideas that are and the antithesis of Judaism and of morality. That's a very great challenge for people not to be influenced when they're outside, when they're exposed to the street, when they're exposed to the marketplace of ideas. That's what Sichon was. He was the negative influence, the external negative influence. But then Og, he represents, it says that he took the mountain and he suspended it over the heads of the Jews, trying to crush them. He was the insidious, the internal threat to the people. And that's why our 1 mezuzah has both functions. It's a protection from the threats on the outside, and it's a protection from the threats inside. Now, we could add another point. Sichon is called the king of Heshbon. That was his capital city. Heshbon is related to the Hebrew word thought. Og, it says, was in a place called Edrei, which also has a meaning of an arm. It's thought versus action. There are 2 kinds of evil. There's the evil thoughts, people who do the right thing. They're not criminals. They don't behave immorally, but their whole thought process is a negative one. And in terms of being in exile, there's something which we call an exile mentality. They see things in a negative way. So while they do good things, they're depressed, they're pessimistic, they have no life, no enthusiasm. They are affected by the negative influence of Sichon, the king of Heshbon, the king of thought. Whereas Og is the one who tries to penetrate the home and bring negative behaviors and influences into the Jewish home. And that's why our mezuzah, the custom is that it's placed on the right side of the door as we enter the home, and it's put on a diagonal. Now, there are really 2 opinions. One says it should be vertical, one says it should be horizontal, so we have the compromise of doing it on a slant, but everything is based on the spiritual definition. The idea is that we put the mezuzah as if to say we want the mezuzah to enter the home, the influence, the positive influences to enter the home, and the bottom part of the mezuzah is there to keep out the negative influences from the street. So we have the mezuzah in terms of space, the mezuzah we put on our doorposts of our homes. But Bnei Yissaschar says there's also a mezuzah in Zman, in time, because the world is based on three things: space, time, and soul. That's taken from the Sefer Yetzirah, the earliest work of Kabbalah, authored by Abraham, the patriarch Abraham. It's a very small book, but with dozens of commentaries and who knows how much depth. And it says there that all of existence is divided into three. There's Olam, world, space; Shana, year, time; Nefesh, soul, energy. Everything else falls into one of these three. So we already know what a mezuzah is in terms of space. You put a mezuzah on that space that separates between your home and the outside. But then there's also the mezuzah in time. And he says the mezuzah in time is the month of Elul, the last month of the year before Rosh Hashanah. Before we enter the new year, we have a mezuzah that protects us, that makes sure our thought processes are proper. It straightens us up and makes sure that our practices are right as we enter the new year. So Elul is the mezuzah in time, but that's in terms of every year. But there's also time in terms of all of human history. We are living in the mezuzah of the Messianic age. We are the last, as the Rabbi would often say, we are the last generation of exile. So we have to prepare the way for the Mashiach. We prepare the way by keeping out the negative influences and allowing the positive influences to come into the world of the future. And it's up to us to be the Mezuzahs. And we know that Balak is trying to stop us, and Sichon and Og are trying to stop us, but that's why there are so many constant threats to us and so many obstacles. But we have the power. We are the holy mezuzah that keeps the negatives out, the negatives that come from the outside and the negatives that lurk within our homes, within our lives. That's the mezuzah in terms of time, but there's also a mezuzah in terms of soul. Mashiach is the ultimate mezuzah. He's the one who, like Moses before him and all the other great Jewish leaders, he's the ultimate leader, will get rid of Golos, take us out of exile, and bring us into redemption. Now, those are not synonymous. You could be out of exile, but you still are not steeped into the dynamic of redemption. The mezuzah has both functions. It does both. It takes us away from the exile, doesn't let it infiltrate, and it allows the atmosphere of redemption to be unsullied and take over and become our major influence. Going back to the Parshah, later on, the Parshah tells us that Bilam, something crazy happened, that his donkey opened up his mouth. And the donkey began to talk to him and chided him for striking it 3 times. Why did God have to perform such a miracle? This is unusual. So one of the explanations is, one is somewhat half serious and half in jest, but it is serious, that you have people who can talk a lot, who can pontificate, who could say a lot of stuff, but you don't have to be impressed with them, because a donkey could also talk. There could be a donkey on 2 feet, on 2 legs. But for Bilam, it was an important lesson. In order for Bilam to say the prophecies that he was going to say, he had to be receptive to it. Now, he was not a nice person, he was not a good person, he was not a holy person. So his ego had to be crushed, because Bilam's ego was his handicap. And let me refer to a statement in the Torah that talks about Bilam as being blind in one eye. Now, what is the significance of Bilam being blind in one eye? Why would the Torah mention that? So there's Hasidic commentary that says that the reason we have 2 eyes is because we have to use one eye, one perspective to see the greatness of God. But the other eye, the other perspective has to be to recognize our own limitations, our own lowliness, our own lack that we need God to fill in. Because a person could be a great philosopher, a great theologian. He knows God's greatness. He knows everything the Torah says about God. But he could still become an egotist. In fact, that itself can make him have a big ego. I know so much about God that even rabbis don't know. And that can make you become arrogant and egotistical. So a person has to have two eyes, two perspectives. One, to know how great God is, and one to know how lowly we are. Bilam had only one eye. We're not talking about physically if he had one eye or two eyes, but it meant spiritually. He had one eye that can see God's greatness, as Bilam himself bragged. Torah describes him, V'yodea das Elyon. He knows the knowledge of God, but when he looked at himself, he was vile. And to the extent that he had to express words that are so powerful and so holy, predicting and prophesying about Mashiach, he had to have his ego crushed. And that's why God had the donkey to speak to him as if to say, who do you think you are? Even a donkey could speak like you. In another talk, we discussed the reason for two eyes. In the context of Mashiach, we also need two perspectives. One perspective we have to have is to recognize how golus, how exile, is not something that we should ever want to remain in. We should realize that exile is covering up reality. Exile does not allow God's presence to be felt. Exile is a place where we don't see each other. We don't see each other's needs. We're not sensitive. There's concealment. There's obstruction. So we first have to see the golus for what it is and cry out to God in the biblical phrase, Ad Masai, how much longer do we have to stay in exile? The other eye has to be about the future. We have to see into the future and live with the future as if it's right now and rejoice, because if you think about how bad it is in exile, that doesn't generate feelings of joy. That's somewhat depressing. So we also have to complement that by looking into the future and realizing Mashiach is soon coming, the Messianic age is imminent, and live our lives now as if Mashiach is actually here and the redemption is already here and everything is perfect. How would we live our lives? We'd be living our lives with great joy, with excitement, with exhilaration, and we'd live our lives with more purity, more holiness, more decency, more sensitivity. So we have to alternate from one to the other, from crying out Ad Masai, how much longer, with one eye, one perspective, how we look at Golus, we look at exile, and then we alternate to looking into the future, to redemption, and we do that with great joy and enthusiasm. God should help that we should see imminently the coming of Mashiach and the final redemption, when we will have both our eyes open to see all the wonders and to look back at exile with nostalgia. Oh, those were the good old days when we could have accomplished so much if we only took our position in this world seriously. And those two eyes, we will gaze at the Shekhinah, at the divine presence in the holy temple, the third holy temple, that will be a combination of the first temple and the second temple. The temples that the Talmud refers to as the eyes of Israel. So we will have both eyes back contained within the third temple. May it unfold imminently.